Cape Palmo, mountain back to Atlantic Ocean, Obomi Hills to Country, to educate, elevate, and promote. Yeah, focus on Liberia, for Liberia, Liberia, for Liberia, yeah. From Monday to Sunday, from Monday to Sunday, it's focus on Liberia. Talk about home affairs, in diaspora, current affairs, reliable information, history, talking about culture, politics, education, entertainment, business, sports, advertisement, articulation. Focus on Liberia. Focus on Liberia. Focus on Liberia. From Monday to Sunday. Focus on.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to yet another edition of the Liberia History Channel on Focus on Liberia. My name is Dennis Jai, and we are broadcasting from Atlanta, Georgia. Last week, we discussed African abolitionists, and we spoke about 3 of them. Today is part 2 of African abolitionists, and we're going to be talking about liberating the slave Barracoons at Cape Mesurado. African abolitionists. If you didn't know before, now you know that there were African abolitionists, people who helped us to stop the transatlantic slave trade and even the slave business that was going on right there in what we know as Liberia today. Let me welcome our presenter, Carl Fambula, who is here with students and graduates of the Liberia Leadership Academy, young scholars that are going to help us discuss this very important topic. Welcome, Carl. Welcome to the show.
Thanks so much, Dennis. It's always my pleasure to be here, especially when my young mentees and future leaders join me. It's always my pleasure.
Thank you. And talking about young mentees and future leaders, let's welcome Yeyia Sharif, who is a student of the Liberia Leadership Academy, and he describes himself as an emerging leader. Yeyia, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mr. Ja. I'm honored to be here for the first time on your show. I'm also open to learn new things on our history, Liberian history.
Thank you. I like your voice. Let me welcome you with a cup of water to say, feel at home. This is Focus on Liberia is for you. So we welcome you. Our hearts are as clear as water. Welcome, sir.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Let me also welcome another Liberia Leadership Academy graduate and now a facilitator, Mr. Trosselli. Mr. Selly, welcome to Focus on Liberia.
Yeah, it's an honor to be here as always, Mr. Ja. It's an honor to be here.
And this is feeling like home, doesn't it? Focus on Liberia is home to you now. We want to welcome all our viewers from across the globe. Here is another time to discuss Liberian history. And Carl, I really love the whole idea of Liberian history is really catching on in Liberia. When I was growing up, this was mainly confined to classrooms, K through 12. Yeah. But now I see history everywhere. I'm happy.
Yeah, I mean, it's important. It helps to build a national identity. If you don't know your history, you don't know what your country's about, who you are, where you've come from, what events transpired in the past to lead the world to be organized as it is today. So it's very important. It's a critical subject, and in fact, in every country I've been to, in the world, they lead with their history. From the moment you arrive at their airports, their important business and government centers, powerful nations are saturated with historical artifacts and monuments and reminders of what they've come from. And so because it helps to build the self-esteem of their citizens, and also it helps to build a cohesion among their citizens. History unites people. History is something that everyone can discuss about their shared and common experience. And without it, we don't know our connections. We don't know that we are more alike than unalike. We don't know that we have suffered together and struggled together and triumphed together if we don't know our story.
Good. Last week, we discussed part one of the African abolitionists, and we talked about three good friends. Those friends are very dear to the hearts of Trust. so Trust, just a recap. I want us to kind of go over and just recap what we discussed. African abolitionists, the untold story of William Tamba, David Noah, and William Davis. Let's start from there and get a kind of idea for those who were not able to join us. Can you give us a and I know Isiaka watched that too, so Isiaka, I'm coming to you next to give me your impression watching that show. But Trust, let me start with you. A little recap of what we did last week.
Okay, so what we did last week, we discussed about William, David, and Noah Tamba, three abolitionists who were formerly slaves, coming all together for the purpose of not only to abolish the slave trade that was happening on the coast, but they also wanted to create an extension of Freetown all the way to Cape Mesurado, something that they were trying to do before the arrival of even ACS. And we also talked about how one of them, being Noah Tamba, sowed the seed for Liberia to exist through connecting ACS to John S. Mill, who later sold Providence Island to ACS. And then Providence Island would later lead to the existence of Liberia. We also further talked about how these men would persecute slave traders on the coast. And doing so would lead to more liberation of slaves that were already on the Grain Coast when these slave traders were persecuted. So, long story short, these men, their work, it was very integral to the existence of Liberia, and that is what we were talking about last week.
Thank you. Isiaka, I know you were not on, but you watched it, and these are things that you guys have been discussing. Give me your own impression about our colleagues, and I call them our colleagues, William Davis, Noah, and Tamba. What was it like watching the show from home?
I'm not sure that he watched it. Did you watch it? I think he was busy that day. That's why he wasn't able to.
I listened to portion of the past show, the portion of it. I listened to it.
Okay.
This is stuff, but the whole idea of African abolitionists, how does that appeal to you?
Yeah, when I listen to the show, and that of what we learned from the previous class, I get to understand that those guys, even though they say on two story, yeah. So I capture the caption of the story. Why is it on two? But it was very important. When I go through it, I get to understand that those guys were looking at slavery practice to be an abomination. Their main goal was to stop slavery ownership. And also went as far as looking at their background, their tribal background. Or William Tamba coming from the Valhone area as a Gisi man, going as far as making sure to try to liberate people. And today we also hear that according to the story, they said another place in Sierra Leone was named after him. Kabu, right? Kabu Regent.
All right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, that is a very good
Yeah, Hawkbrook. I think you're talking
This,
about Hawkbrook. Yeah.
you getting me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that was
Yes,
very
getting you.
important to me also to know that one of our owns, went as far as going in Sierra Leone to practice, abolition or revolution movement, and having a place that are named after him
Yeah.
because
Wow.
of his struggle. Yeah,
Thank you.
actually captured. I can be proud of that. Maybe today when I'm going in Sierra Leone, when I
Yeah.
reach out to that place, I will say, this place is my place because it's one of my owns that they were named
Exactly.
after.
So
Yeah,
Thank
I
you.
love
so
it.
I'm actually
Great.
proud of that. Yeah,
Thank you.
That's
and
nice.
looking at David
Yeah.
Noah too also, who was very little and trying by all means, because according to the story, they said they spoke many languages.
Hmm.
Yeah, so looking at their ability to understand some of the languages, even though they were not originated from there, it was a very good thing to know too also.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I learned all that. For me, what I captured was they were looking at that the practice of captivity to be an abomination to them. So they needed to
Yeah.
stop it. Yeah, they needed to stop it. And because of them today, most of our people were free, they were liberated.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Carl, before we start, anything else you want to say about what we did the last time, last week? Oh, my
No,
call.
I think the people can go and watch the show. I don't think I want to, spend too much time on last week. They can always go back, and I would encourage people to watch that as well. Um, but this is a continuation of that story. But just to know that the people, the main characters in the African abolition story are people who themselves either suffered the dehumanization of being enslaved, of being human chattel, and then were rescued and decided, instead of me just living my life out because I escaped this place, I'm going to reach back and make sure that these horrors don't happen to other people. And this is a continuation of that. A lot of times when we're telling stories of history, we focus on the European actors. The British are put up as the heroes. But how did they know where to go, and who testified, who gave firsthand accounts and testimony against people who formerly owned and abused them or had them in chains? And they didn't know if there were going to be consequences and repercussions. They risked their lives. Last week, we talked about Atamba, who was from Vaun, being sold into slavery, being rescued, resettled near Freetown, returning to a place where he could have been recaptured and sold again to preach the gospel and to try to encourage. And also, he was on a reconnaissance mission. He also gathered intelligence. He took Mr. Coates, who was a British agent, with him. So Coates now is aware of where these Barracoons are. So Tamba is taking this British agent to places where they would not have previously gone if you're not involved in the slave trade. So it's a very powerful story. Please go back and watch it.
You can check out our YouTube channel. You see the playlist, the Liberating History channel, and you watch it. Today we're going to be on part 2, Liberating the Slave Barracoons at Cape Mesurado.
Yes.
And
So we're going to talk about very specific slave traders, very specific locations of their business, very specific people, and very specific incidences that occurred that are documented. I want to remind everyone that the History Channel presentations are focused on documentation, not hearsay, not they say, not speculation, but what was written at the times. So much of this presentation is from court records and testimonies at the court in Sierra Leone against those who were selling slaves at Cape Mesurado. which is now in Liberia. Um, I'm not focused on Cape Mount or Little Bassa or any of these other places. Today's episode is specifically about Cape Mesurado and the Barracoons that were there and what happened to them and how they were destroyed and how that destruction of those very specific slave Barracoons made it possible for ACS to even acquire a place to repatriate or resettle the people who had been on the ship Elizabeth and the Brignalists that were stationed in what is now Sierra Leone.
Thank you. And in today's episode, I'm going to be assisted by the young scholar from the Liberal Leadership Academy, Mr. Trust Silly.
Yes. All right.
So,
Yes, you want me to read this one, right? Okay,
yeah,
I'm going to
you
read now.
read this one and then.
Okay. Merchant Lace received many letters from Grande King George. They consisted chiefly of long lists of his requirements. His phonetic spelling and complete lack of punctuation rendered them arduous reading. Send some lucky glasses at 2 corps and 4 cups of trade for trade and kumi and small bells. Let them be good ones, and send me some lango some large and some small and some curl beads. Send me 1 lucky glass 6 foot long and 6 foot wide. Let it have a strong wooden frame. Send me 1 table and 6 chairs for my house, and 1 armchair for myself to sit in. He demanded knives and forks, tankards, and even a close stool for his house, and red and blue coats, gold lace hats, and razor for his person. He had, in fact, become a parasite of the slave trader. From the
You can
trade
stop
goods,
there. Yeah, you can stop
yeah,
there. Thank you, Paul. So
yeah, welcome.
this, Dennis, is and Paul and Yeyia, this is an account of King George. And as we know, King George is the one who, after the repatriated people were settled at Providence Island, he was able to give them a place to stay on the mainland on the actual Cape later. But I found it interesting that his greed for really frivolous things, silly things, was what was driving his involvement in the slave trade. He's asking European merchant Lace, British merchant Lace, to bring him frivolous things so he could exchange them for human beings, or exchange human beings for these frivolous things. And they're referring to Grande King George as a king. And one of the things I've discussed with my students in the class, my mentees, I should say, is that this term king is used very loosely upon people who are really nothing more than warlords. So we get confused in looking at our own history because the definitions or the titles that are being bestowed upon the people that we're reading about are not being bestowed upon them by any kind of tradition. They're being bestowed upon them by the Europeans. And it is very important for the Europeans to write that these people are kings. And the reason the Europeans must call them kings is because their own laws require that they deal and trade with legitimate leaders.
Right.
It gives legitimacy to their trade. So when you're interacting with a king, if you sign a treaty for land with a king, if you purchase ivory or gold or human beings from a king, it grants you legitimacy. They cannot say that this guy calling himself George is a warlord, a gangster who has a armed force that he takes into villages and raids for human beings. Or he pays people who have gone and raided and stolen human beings, and he pays those people, and he maybe was a middleman who is now going to trade those kidnapped, forcibly removed human beings to Europeans for very frivolous items. This is not the work of an African king. African kings controlled vast territories and trade routes. This is what a gangster would find to be something that was worth something. I want some razors. I want this. This is not the wisdom and the dignity of an African king. So I just want everybody to remember, when you are looking at these historic documents, who bestowed the title of king upon a slave trader? His criminal business partners who need to give some legitimacy to what they're doing. Oh, we're dealing with a king.
That's very important. That's a big eye opener. That although we have kings, the title king existed among the Africans, right? But not this guy. And how do we know that?
So you can infer that just by his conduct.
Okay.
Because if you study our culture, our culture and the traditions, if you look at the even after Liberia was established, and you look at the amount of dignity King Momoru and these people had in their interaction, they were not beggars. They had so much dignity and self-respect. Even after the degradation, the fighting with the Europeans and the rolling wars, they still carried themselves differently. Because in Africa, our leaders do not become leaders in a way that would be undignified or make them undignified. They become leaders because they're dignified. And when they interact with others, they do so from a position of authority. Just the demeanor of this so-called king implies that he was no more than a gang leader. Just because you're commanding armed men, it doesn't mean that you are a monarch. The Bloods and Crips used to command armed men. It doesn't mean you're a monarch.
And I like how they say his phonetic spelling and his complete lack of punctuation. Right. So looking
So
glass.
yeah, a lot of these people. Remember, we talked. This is from. I'm sorry, I didn't explain. This excerpt is from the 1700s. So this is from. This is from the year 1775. I had to go check my reference. Sorry, from the year 1775. And they're explaining their interaction with this person, who was at this time relatively young as well. And I don't know if you all remember the Boatswain episode where Boatswain is bragging that he cut off old King George's head.
Yeah.
This is old King George when he was much younger. So people didn't like his business. He was annoying.
Oh,
But I find it interesting that he had some understanding of literacy. He could read and write. If they were able to make out what he was saying, they weren't about his punctuation and all these things. I'm sure writing in a different language that he hadn't mastered as well as his native tongue and all these things. I'm actually impressed that he was literate to the point that they could read and document what he said.
So you say he want mirror, looking glass, some
Yeah, so que sí es
some
a
mirror.
bluff white things.
Or maybe you were saying.
You want
Yeah,
bells?
looking glass is what they called mirrors.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I thought it was those spyglass that sailors use.
That's mirror. Glass. And you want knives. You want looking glass 6 foot long and 6 foot wide.
So small queer things, right? So you can bluff people and go and get somebody's daughter to marry him and add to his harem, right?
Yeah,
That's what this was. This is not the. I mean, this is not the demeanor of royalty in Africa.
He wants red and blue coats, gold lace hats, and razors for his person. Remember one shave.
So I want to laugh a little bit. So people always say, "Oh, they're red and blue color." It's not African. African people love the color combination. There's so many examples of this.
Yeah, he wants red and blue.
Mm. This
Yeah.
is this you talking about in the year 1775.
And this is the guy, King George. I mean, Bosman said
He
he
cut off his head.
cut his neck. And I memorized that, in fourth grade. Having sold your country and accepted payments. Bosman's speech.
Oh,
Was
you memorized both ways speech.
Yeah. It went like this: having sold your country and accepted payments, you must take these consequences and let the Americans have their land immediately. Whosoever is not satisfied with my decision, let him come and tell me so. And it went on and on and on and on
And
like
then
that.
he said he had to remind him that he had cut off old King George's
Yeah.
head.
He said the same thing I did to old King George when I went to settle disputes along the coast. Trust?
Yes, sir. Let's go. The slave traders of Cape Mesurado. Robert Bostock. Of Brighton, Bostock was the son of a Liverpool slave trader of the same name. Bostock followed in his father's footsteps and co-owned slave trading factories at Galenas and the St. Paul River in West Africa. He was subsequently arrested in 1813, convicted of illegal slave dealing, and transported to Australia for a term of 14 years. He later had his conviction overturned and became a free settler in Tasmania. John McQueen, originally from Glasgow, Scotland, McQueen had been apprenticed to a slave factory in Africa as a child and later worked as Bostock's assistant at the St. Paul River. He was captured, tried, and convicted with Bostock, and also went to Australia, where he again worked for Bostock in Sydney.
So these are two of the slave traders. There's two more we'll get to on the next slide, but these are two of the slave traders who had the last foreign controlled slave barracoons at Cape Mesurado. They are not the last Europeans to hold slave barracoons on what is now Liberian territory. So, but they're the last at the Cape. So these are the two Europeans, and the next two people we're going to talk about are half European, half African. So we have a Briton, a British, and at that time, Britain controlled Scotland. So even McQueen, who was Scottish, was under the British crown. So he was a British subject. This is going to be important later because the English laws, the British laws, gave them jurisdiction over their own territory and their citizens, their subjects and citizens. So if you were doing something wrong in British controlled territory like Freetown or Cape Coast, they could arrest you even if you were an African. If you were you're a British subject operating in sovereign African territory doing something illegal, they could arrest you because you're a British subject. But if you are an African doing illegal slave trading on African sovereign territory, the British could not arrest you at this time in history in 1813. So this idea that the British or the Europeans did not recognize African sovereignty is false. But they used other ways to pressure Africans into signing treaties and things like that. Doesn't mean that they didn't do anything by coercion, but based on their own laws, they were not able to just seize territory in West Africa that was not yet, claimed through treaty. So at no time did the British actually sign any treaties to acquire land at Cape Mesurado. And if you go back and watch the episode, The King Peters of Cape Mesurado, you will understand why. And maybe Isiaka can talk a little bit about, the King Peters. Why is it that they didn't sell land at Cape Mesurado on the Cape? They wanted to control, the Cape for their own economic reasons.
Yeah.
Are y'all hearing me?
Yeah, exactly
Okay.
so.
So let's go to the
Yes,
next
we're
two
hearing you.
slave trade. Go ahead. Trust, you were saying something?
Sure. No, go ahead. You can go to the next slide.
Okay, let's talk about the two other slave traders. Trust. We got Trust. You can go
Yeah,
ahead.
sorry, little malfunction. Okay.
Dennis, you can go ahead and read it just for
We have
continuation.
slave traders of Cape Mesurado, Philippa Hayes and Charles
Just
Mason.
go with the slide right now, Dennis. Mine. Yeah.
All right. Philippa Hayes, the daughter of an African mother and American father. Philippa had married an Englishman, William Hayes. He was the official owner of the property, but in May 1813 had returned to England, leaving Philippa and their daughter Hannah behind. Hayes became close trading partners of Bostock and his trusted friends. Charles Mason, an American slave trader, Mason co-owned the slave trading factories at Gallinas and the St. Paul River with Bostock. Away in Charleston or Havana at the time of Bostock and McQueen's arrest, Mason continued slave trading but was later captured by another British patrol and taken to Freetown. As an American, he could not be tried by the British court, but he drowned when his ship sank on the way back across the Atlantic.
So I point of correction. I thought I had Philippa Hayes and John Sterling Mill on this slide, but Mason was not mulatto. He was white, and he was from Charleston, South Carolina. So I apologize. I misspoke. So Philippa Hayes, though, was clearly, as it's described, her mother was what would be considered Liberian indigenous today, and her father was an Englishman, just like John Sterling Mill, but they were two different English people. So what this is telling you is even before McQueen came to settle there, there were other Englishmen selling slaves in these places long before, right? These are just the last traders. So
Right.
Philippa Hayes herself is the daughter of an English slave trader. John Sterling Mill is the son of an English slave trader with the same name. So this is something that has been going on and is documented at this very location since the 1700s, the early 1700s, actually.
Wow.
So, and the other thing I think is very important to mention, because I think many people are aware that the British had a presence and British people were living on the coast before 1822, but many people are not aware that a white American,
Right.
Mason. So, maybe getting feedback from Isiaka or something about that, because that's a very important point.
Isiaka, can you hear me? Isiaka,
I think the network in Liberia might be giving us a little bit of a challenge. Which is fine.
Are you getting me?
Yes. So Isiaka, the slave traders at Cape Mesurado, besides the British, we talk about John Mills and now Philippa, who's African mother and British father. We have Charles Mason, American, white American, also there as a slave trader. This is not something that we normally talk about in Liberian history about actually white American slave traders. I know you came across this in the class. Isiaka, are you
I think
me?
they're having network issues. So let's just continue, Dennis.
All right. No, but Carl, this is important because a lot of us, the time we hear about Americans, is the coming of the African Americans or the
ACS.
The ACS. That's the time. But to have these Americans at that time, that's new.
I mean, yeah, I guess it's new as far as new information for some, but it's really important because the British and the Americans are very much involved in trying to stop the slave trade because their citizens were involved. So they know that their citizens are operating along the coast. And sometimes American slave traders would do false flags. They would put up a Spanish flag. And there are Americans or sometimes mixed crew people on the boat. So these people, these slave traders were very sophisticated in trying to elude authorities. We can go to the next slide.
We got a map.
Yeah, Lone Star is something else, isn't it?
Yeah.
So basically, these 4 arrows are pointing to the slave barracoons. So from going clockwise from the top left there, that would have been John S. Mill. The slave barracoon that's right there at the tip of Bushrod Island is Vietown. Everybody knows Vietown was a slave barracoon where these slave traders were settled. And Vietown still exists today. It was there, it's called Vietown because they had, the settlement of Vi people, but they were basically slave traders. And then at Bali Island, some people say Philippa Hayes had her factory on Bushrod Island, but I believe based on the descriptions that she was actually at Bali Island, which this area is a lot more swampy now than it had been in the past. And I also want you to take note that Providence Island has because of it's an alluvial island, it is basically one landmass now instead of 2. So a lot of times when people are reading the history, they get confused when they say 2 islands. They're talking about Bushrod Island. They think they're talking about something else. Providence Island is not a consistent, solid piece of land because it's an alluvial island formed by sediment in the river. It can change shape, change size, split into 2 based on water levels and all of those kinds of factors. But that is Providence Island. Those 2 arrows are pointing to what is today still Providence Island. We can go to the next slide.
So Bostock and Mason. Okay. Bostock and Mason appear to have established the Cape Mesurado factory has a feeder factory.
So I just want to also point out to listeners, Dennis, who might not know, factory is basically a old English word for store or place that you can purchase things, right? So this factory is really a slave barracoon. It's a place that you can go and buy human beings that are being held in captivity, that were taken forcibly from their homes. So this is important. The English make it sound very nice. So it's a factory. It was a horrible, horrible place of death and torture and despair. Go ahead, please.
Okay. And so Bostock and Mason appear to have established the Cape Mesurado slave barracoon has a feeder barracoon, slave barracoon. And in this, they were ahead of the game. Rare at other parts of the African coast, at Sierra Leone and along the Windward coast, the practice of transshipping captives along the seaboard was becoming commonplace. With the slave trade illegal and the patrols heating up, the main imperative was to elude their intentions, and transporting slaves along the coast helped. Slaves could be transshipped quickly and quietly to whichever place the patrols were not present, ensuring a full shipment was available to slave ships that landed there. Bostock, Mason, and McQueen could not possibly foresee this new country of liberty, but they knew that calamity was skulking offshore. They were on the front lines of a battle over slavery and freedom, so close to the abolitionist enemies that they were virtually spies behind enemy lines. Just up the coast, a scant 2 days sail away, was the free British colony of Sierra Leone, founded 28 years earlier. It had begun as a place of freedom for Africans, a way to exhibit what Africa could be without the slave trade. Since 1808 and the outlawing of the slave trade, it had become the base of the British Navy's anti-slavery patrol and home to a growing community of recaptured Africans free from the slave ships seized for illegal trading.
You have any questions on that?
Well,
I mean, it's pretty detailed. I think for me, what really stands out is how complex once the slave trade was the transatlantic slave trade was made illegal by the British in 1807, and then the Americans ratified that in 1808 and joined them. They had to be more elusive. And so the main factories that they were working at near Sierra Leone, near Freetown, near the Rio Pongos in coastal Guinea, those were shut down. So now they're moving further down the coast where the British don't have any control. And the British can only stop the ships when they're already at sea. But they were safe operating their factories there. It's unfortunate. And it also explains about the pressure they were under. It lays this foundation and the basis for why they didn't want ACS establishing another Freetown at Cape Mesurado. This is the basis of the conflict. Here, it's 1810, 1812, 1813. The fact that Freetown had a no slavery zone, and that distant place, Freetown from Cape Mesurado, was a threat. Imagine having something similar established right in their midst. Because remember when ACS landed and was able to acquire Providence Island, it's only the Cape that had the Barracoons disrupted. On the St. Paul River, they were still active. Just down in Marshall, they were still active. Cape Mount, of course, they were active. Bassa Cove. So this was Trade Town, all these places along the coast. This was just a small little area of that we were focused on today. And it's because these guys were stopped that John S. Mill was able to negotiate and give Cape Mesurado Providence Island to the repatriated people.
Right, and Carl, we normally talk about the Africans selling other Africans, which I know happened, but with the existence of these barracoons, of these slave factories, they were raiding homes. So the regular people, did they have much choice?
Yes, you're saying when you say much choice in what? Choice in what?
In selling other people.
Of course, you have a choice.
Mm-hmm. Because this, and what was that choice? Because they were raiding them, right?
The Europeans were not the ones going into the villages at this point in history. You know, Boatswain was given weapons and he gathered men and they marched to Bopolu with a British flag. There were no white men with them. Mm-hmm. Right? When he established himself as a slave catcher, as a slave catcher in the rainforest in Bopolu, there were no white men with him. The thing is, Boatswain was raised in a culture of slavery. He was taken onto a ship as a ship hand as a very young man, very young boy, a kid really, by his own testimony. And so he grew up as a hand, like a assistant, a deckhand on a slave ship, going between Liverpool and Barbados and the Bahamas and all these islands that the British were selling human beings to back to West Africa. And when he reached a certain age, they sent him on a mission. You're now free. You don't have to work on the ship anymore. Young Sherbro boy who probably spoke Kisi fluently, and sure because the Balam and the Kisi languages are so similar. and sent him on a mission. He was not a king.
He had
He was
guns.
not a king.
So they gave him guns and like so he recruited his own army, like gangsters, to go and do
Yeah,
that.
yeah. And he did this until he got old, right? He did this until he died. Like this was not, he had a choice. He didn't have to do it. He could have gone up to Bopolu and just say, you know, I'm not going to engage in selling slaves. Let's do something else. But it had become a culture. And this idea also of Africans selling other Africans, the concept of being African and everybody being the same is a political concept. It's not really a cultural reality. Human beings are identify themselves by culture and language, right? So even the Europeans just recently tried to form the EU. They don't need, the Scottish and the Britons don't see themselves as the same people. So nobody ever says, oh, the Britons are hurting their own people when they're fighting Ireland and killing Irish people. And nobody ever says the Britons are killing their own people when they're suppressing Scotland. They all speak the same language. Nobody says that. It's only with Africans who want to oversimplify human behavior and make it look like it's not something that is universally human to fight, to wage war, and to do acts of treachery. The unfortunate thing about this is that the transatlantic slave trade targeted people based on their Africanness. It wasn't like they were only buying Fula people. They were only buying, Bassa people. They were selling and buying and trading and tormenting everyone, and the common denominator was our skin.
Yeah. And so what was being depicted here?
So I was just showing one of the pictures, sketches that was drawn in the time period of a harem belonging to a slave trader. Now, they had these enslaved women that were not free to go, and they would keep them and sleep with them and have children with them. So there's a huge European genetic legacy in West Africa, in Liberia specifically. We're focused on Liberia right now. So many of the coastal people have the genetic ancestry of European slave traders. Because John S. Mill had children. Philippa Hayes, her daughter was there. Her daughter gets married and has children. At Cape Mount, there were a significant number of mulattoes at Cape Mount. There were slave traders having children with people, ordinary merchants who were not selling slaves, but the slave traders that were settled there were treating the women like objects. And sometimes if they would bring a caravan of slaves, if one of them was young and attractive, they say, oh, I'm keeping this one with me. And they wouldn't be put on the ship. Sometimes they say, you know what, I'm going to keep this one for myself. And they would make them work while they would rape them and have children with them. It was a horrible situation.
It was from there that shocking news arrived at Cape Mesurado. The British anti-slavery patrol had arrested two slavery merchants, Charles Hickson and Simeon Samo. Hickson owned an operation at the Els de Lo. Samo was owner of the slaving factory Charleston in the Rio Pongo. Both men had been taken to Freetown to stand trial for illegal slave trading. The trial began on April 7, 1812.
So the Rio Pongos is coastal Guinea. So they're not too far from Cape Mesurado. So the slave traders at Cape Mesurado and all in the vicinity are getting word that what? The British anti-slavers, they think, so this is started 1807. They had not really tried anyone yet. Now they have captured Samuel, they've captured Hickson, they've captured white men, and they took them to Freetown and tried them. This is a year before they come to Cape Mesurado and grab our oppressors and try them. But here they're being tried. And I want to point out the reason this is important is because these men were able to be convicted because of the testimony of people that they had held in captivity. And the recaptured Africans who could speak the language of those in captivity were able to act as translators in court. The courage that it took for these people to testify in a court system that they're not familiar with, thinking that they would be put to death or there'd be some form of retaliation as a result. Just incredible. Absolutely incredible. And they're testifying in great detail. And it is so credible because of the detail that they offered. And they also were able to provide valuable information to the British Navy and even escort them to places to gather evidence against these people and convict them. There are, and we'll go on, but the reason it's very, very important. It's the testimony of the Africans. It is the rebellion of the Africans that makes any of this even possible. We can go to the next slide.
In June 1812, faraway events again colluded to change business for Mason and Bostock when their nations went to war. The origins of the War of 1812 are convoluted, but the transatlantic slave trade and its morality and legality were caught up in the whole affair. The United States was fighting for free trade and the rights of its sailors to be saved from being impressed by the British Navy. This affected the rights of Britain's Navy to stop and search American vessels believed to be illegally trading in slaves. Before the war, President James Madison had permitted the Royal Navy to search American vessels believed to be slave trading. It led to something the United States did not intend. The U.S. flag began to be widely used to hide the illegal slave trade from Africa to Cuba.
Yeah. So that's what I was alluding to earlier. But I want to point out this thing about the War of 1812 and just kind of show you guys how incredibly profound this is. Elijah Johnson, who repatriated to Liberia on the ship Elizabeth initially they took them to Sherbro Island in 1819, 1820. He fought he's a veteran of the War of 1812. Elijah Johnson fought in the War of 1812. He is a staunch enemy of the British because the war was between the British and the Americans, and they won. It is these African-American soldiers that all historians agree had not been for them, the British may have won that war. One of the things that happens with Elijah Johnson is he goes to Liberia. He's one of those first people that settle at Providence Island and then go on to the mainland thanks to King George. So all of these things are connected. So while this is happening in the vicinity of Elijah Johnson's future home, I'm wondering to myself, was he even imagining in the year 1812 that he would go to Africa one day? Was it even in his mind when he was fighting this war that he would also have a standoff with the British again? When they came after, so this is very profound. We can go to the next slide,
John,
unless you have a question. Oh, I
John
wanted to shout out this book. I recently read this book. So it talks about all of the wars from the it talks about all the wars from the War of Independence all the way until the Civil War, and the African American soldiers and their stories and their heroics. So Elijah Johnson had valor. He was a hero because he was a veteran of a very difficult, very, very difficult war that they struggled and won on behalf of the United States. After which, he wasn't treated like a human being. After winning a war for a country, he wasn't being treated like a human being. That was some of the motivation for him to leave, and decided he would go to the land of his origins.
is continuing. John Roach, a British mariner. Roach was captain of the brig Kitty with a letter of marque to capture enemy vessels and was trading with Bostock and McQueen. In 1813, British argued with Bostock. No, in 1813, Roach argued with Bostock and reported the latter's illegal slave dealing in Freetown, leading to the British naval attack on Bostock and Mason's St. Paul factory. Roach was later murdered, apparently in revenge for these actions.
Right. So there's a lot that's going to happen. We'll go on to the next slide. We're going to really explain. So Roach was a slave merchant himself, a slave trader himself. He would purchase slaves and he would carry them to across the Atlantic. Bostock and McQueen are gangsters, super gangsters. They're doing horrible things and making people angry. Roach basically, and we'll go to the next slide and you'll get to see what happens. But the St. Paul factory and the Cape Mesurado factories are shut down partly because of John Roach, and mostly because of the Africans who create circumstances in which it would be possible for the British to not only go there, but have reason to shut the factories down. Let's go to the next slide. I'm going to give the next slide gives a little bit more background on the brig Kitty and what the conflict between McQueen and Bostock actually was. So the problem actually began in 1808. But go ahead and read.
In May 1808, Roach had dropped anchor back in Liverpool aboard the slaver May and had professed himself a changed man about to embark on a new career. Slave trading was in the past, abolition a reality. He gained a letter of marque and became a privateer. By 1813, he claimed to be a patriot capturing enemy ships. This allowed him to also infer his abolitionist credentials. A slave trader showed the error of his ways by capturing slave ships. Yet his first venture into this had been curious at best. The Amelia had traded at Cabinda and sailed with 275 slaves aboard before an African-American crewman had encouraged the captives to revolt. The mutineers kept some of the crew alive to help and likely tried to sail back from where they had come. Instead, they sailed around the coast of Africa for 4 months until, dying from hunger and thirst, they landed at Cape Mount to beg for water. But those who ventured ashore to ask for help were ambushed and again held captive by Bostock's men. What?
Can you imagine that horror? So I want to say something. So they said they never named the African-American crewman. They never gave his name. I wasn't able to find it. Maybe there's some other records where his name is evident, but I wasn't able to see it. So they don't name this African-American crewman. I really doubt he was African-American at all. He may have been an American, indentured American or African in America. I don't know what they meant by African-American, but they have this person who spoke English and was on an American slave ship. So they probably just assumed he was African American, because this is a secondary source, as the description of him being an African American. I was able to see another description where it said that a crewman on the ship. So I don't know who this was, what his origin was, but clearly he was Black. And he was sick of it. And had come to the point where he assisted in creating a mutiny, liberating the enslaved people, overpowering the ship, but unfortunately, they didn't have the good ending that the Amistad Rebellion had. So they're able to he's able to help to liberate his own people. They're free, but they're drifting, and then they run out of water. For people who were on the bulk challenge, imagine that. So they're drifting like this. 275 people on, it isn't even a big tanker with an engine like that. It's a sailboat. These boats had sails. They weren't even steamships. So you had to understand how to use the mask and navigation systems that were very crude. They didn't know how to get, so finally they run ashore at Cape Mesurado. This is going to be the most treacherous thing. The other enslaved people, the other Africans who are enslaved working there, and the free people all witnessed this horrible treachery of Bostock telling his men, hey, we got free slaves. Y'all grab them, we're going to sell them again. Meaning we got a bunch of people that we can just take. And they were weak, they were dehydrated, they landed in the wrong place. They fell back into the hands of slave traders. Horrible.
Horrible indeed.
So, I mean, this you can you can skip over this slide. This is redundant. Okay, so Yara, who was one of the guys who testified, and then you've got Sisse, he changed his name to Lawrence Summers, and he ended up remaining in Sierra Leone, but he was one of those people again who testified against Bostock, was very, very eloquent in his testimony against Bostock. So two of the African abolitionists in this story would be Lawrence Summers and John Reffel. John Reffel's original name in the database was Yara, and then Lawrence Summers was Sisse. Sisse, which was probably Maninka or Mendi, what his actual ethnicity is, because that name is used by different groups. Same thing with Yara.
So Tom Ball and Yara. So who's
Yeah.
Tom Ball?
Tom Ball was Basa. He's another person who testified as well.
So Tom Ball and Yara agreed to give accounts of what Bostock, this wicked guy, and McQueen had been doing, of the captives and the ships. They had grown horrific jobs guiding and feeding and loading aboard slave vessels on June 9, 20. That's not 2013.
Oh, it says this should be 1813. I don't know, maybe autocorrected. It should be 1813.
On June 9, 1813, Yara gave his evidence before Judge Robert Purdy and Purdy's assistant. There is no record of whether Purdy wore formal court dress as required by the Lord Chamberlain, and also presented himself sweating in intense humidity in a dark colored frock coat and breeches with white silk stockings and wig.
Yeah.
Jesus Christ.
So they tried to dress them up. You remember, these guys are coming, some of them are naked, some of them are wearing rags, loincloth. You know, they're being treated like almost like animals. And here, for the sake of the courts, you have these recaptured. Oh, I left something very important out. So the recaptured Africans are working as translators for these people who are being rescued, the new recaptured Africans, right? And they're also helping them to dress the part so that when you go to court, they have to explain to them, be brave, don't be afraid, look these people in the eye, tell them what happened. They're coaching these newly released slaves in how to testify so that these offenders can be condemned. Imagine you're treating people like less than animals, and those same people have the courage later to explain your crimes against them and others, the murders they committed. We can go to the next slide.
So that's
Oh, it's the same slide?
yeah, Tom and the already agreed. Okay, yeah.
Yeah. So that's basically how these Barracoons were shut down. That is basically how those 3 slave factories were destroyed at Cape Mesurado. It was a combination of mutinies orchestrated by the enslaved people themselves and their English-speaking, literate predecessors who were recaptured a few years before, who still spoke the dialect. So you're talking about between 1807 and 1813, those people who were rescued in that time period cooperating to end the Barracoons. Of course, we all know from last week that William Tamba is the main instigator here. He's the main person orchestrating all of this. William Tamba making sure that those Barracoons shut down. William Tamba making sure that, and his colleagues and the other enslaved people making sure that at least that place at Cape Mesurado was no longer a functioning slave barracoon and that the English couldn't continue. But unfortunately, they were not able to stop the Africans, the sovereign African warlords from continuing the illegal trade. That would have been later on when Joseph Jenkins Roberts comes in and starts working with the British over the few years that he had to snuff out at Cape Mount and all of the other factories along our coast, going all the way into what is now Ivory Coast. So Roberts is on a legacy of African abolitionists. The difference between Roberts and the people who were recaptured is that Roberts, because he has the authority of the British Navy, who could have previously not gone and fought Africans, Roberts' mantra was, "This is Africa, and we," meaning we, the repatriated people, are Africans. So we will go in with the violence. It is not on the British authority, but on our own authority to shut the Barracoons down. So the British were only offering support, contrary to how a lot of people explain it. Because before Joseph Jenkins Roberts, the British never, ever entered these Barracoons and blew them up. It was Joseph Jenkins Roberts who did that. And in his own testimony, Roberts, when he went to Barbados to try to recruit people to go back to Liberia, he told the patriarch of the Barclay family and all of those that were listening to his presentation when he showed up in Barbados, that I, Joseph Jenkins Roberts, have done more to snuff out the slave trade in Africa or to end the slave trade in Africa than all the natives of Europe combined. He referred to the Europeans as natives of Europe. That he, Roberts, was taking responsibility for finally shutting it down. Very powerful. But this was the precursor to it. So, I mean, my helpers are not here because Liberia and Lone Star or whatever cell phone company they're using isn't operating correctly. So that concludes my presentation, or our would have been presentation.
I see these nice paintings of the horror of this slavery. So that concludes the presentation on African Abolitionists Part 2. Liberating the Slave Barracoons at Cape Mesurado. I'm sure you have questions, you have comments, and we want to hear from you. Call the number that's on your screen, 605-313-6004. The code is 791-403 #.
Yeah.
And we have people watching here. Stephen Gusesh Shalom. Stephen say, I'm watching from Brewerville, Monrovia, or Mesurado County, Liberia. Tariq is watching from Antigua. Call you help me to pronounce this.
Antigua and Barbuda.
Yeah, Antigua. We used to say Antigua, but you told me it's Antigua.
It's Antigua. It's my adopted country.
Prince
I'm
Connor
from Green Bay Hill in Antigua.
Prince is following from Greenville City. Used to be the most beautiful city in Liberia.
Of course, you would say that.
Greenville. And Mova Ya said something that I want us to talk about a little bit. Say, Carl, this should debunk the narrative that seems to imply that Africans sold their own people for goods. It was these folks like King George did for their own benefits and greed.
Mm-hmm.
And Carl, as someone who was in the Liberian Civil War, sometimes when we're talking about these things, I kind of think about it, right? Because these warlords control the areas and they were doing everything, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you were there or if you are outside, you would think that, oh, this is how the people, like when we were in the war and I saw Burkina-based soldiers, people, and we were told that the insurgents, they were allowed by Cote d'Ivoire to enter Liberia. And so being in the war, I personally was bitter against Ivory Coast. I mean, the entire Ivory Coast. You don't even care that these things are allowed by leaders and sometimes gangsters. And the Burkina-based that were fighting, little did I know that these people were people that were living on the fringes of society. Right. They were not real regular people, right? But
yeah. Yeah. War.
That it's just Burkina Faso that is against Liberia that is fighting.
What war does is it brings out the people that live on the margins of society. Weapons empower them, not tradition, not wisdom, not honor. They're empowered by violence. And we need to really understand the difference. Even now in Liberia, it seems that we've forgotten. Traditionally, the guy who taps palm wine is not going to be sitting on the Council of Wise Men. The town crier is not going to be sitting on the Council of Wise Men. The guy who is the culture dancer, right, that comes out and the gesture that precedes the mass dancer, he's not going to be sitting on the Council of Wise Men. You have to go through very rigorous training. Before you even go through the training, they got to see it in you before they groom you for leadership. So a true king would never behave like that in our tradition. These are not traditional leaders. These are people who have filled the vacuum that war leaves behind. We even see that today. Many of the people who lead us today haven't really earned that place. They're filling a vacuum. They haven't gone through the things that Jackson Fiado and Edward Kessley went through. They're not going through what Nettie C.A. Burnell went through, which is going to school, grooming themselves, growing their minds. They're not going through what Didwo Waletoa went through. They just get up and through some act of unfortunate circumstances, they fill a void that was left by a lot of death and a lot of people who fled. So whenever we see these things and you see the way that they're behaving, and it's not really becoming of a traditional African leader, it stems from the fact that we had these rolling wars and the true kings of the land had probably long been dead because of the slave trade. But who is left? Warlords.
It is sad. If you're watching, we have no colors here. Let me read this comment from Oxford, bro. Hi, Carl and Dennis. Happy to catch you guys live. I just wanted to know you guys feature on my undergraduate dissertation. I got an overall first and won an award for my writing. Thank you, guys. Just wanted to let you know. So, Oxford, thank you. Just want to know a little more.
Yeah, I
If
would
you
like
don't
to know
mind.
what his undergraduate dissertation was about.
Yeah.
That's great. Wonderful.
Anthony McGill, peace, Miss Carl family.
How are you?
Okay, Carl, we don't have any. Unfortunately, the young scholars from Monrovia couldn't continue due to
Yeah,
their connection issue. We are praying for a day and hoping that one day we're not going to go through all this trouble to get connection from Liberia.
yeah. Anthony says hi to you too, Dennis. Yeah, it's very unfortunate. The GSM companies have been doing a great disservice to our people these last few days. Hopefully, LTA can force them into
Oh,
action.
Anthony. Oh, no, Anthony. First of all, go in, coach. You didn't say hi to me first.
Yeah. So anyway, this story of these African abolitionists, these people who did all they could, as we said, is very important. People were not just complacent. They didn't build huge forts and have to have cannons and weapons. And, Elmina Castle and Goree Island, they didn't have to put the slave Barracoon at Providence Island, where it's surrounded by water, and all of these things. And they didn't do those things because it was fun. They did it because there was resistance. If they didn't barricade themselves, if they didn't have weapons, it would have never happened.
Yeah.
And so, unfortunately, many of the human beings who were traded and sold, they were sold for weapons so that they could, their sellers could get more human beings. Horrible situation.
And Oxford said, he put he says his dissertation was entitled Contested History, Online Communities' Role in Reconstructing Liberian History and Identity.
Oh,
So as for you have our email here, let's talk more.
yeah, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, let's talk more about this. We are interested.
That's a great topic. Very creative.
Yeah. There's about 60 slave castle dungeons and other memorials along the coast of West Africa from Senegal to Angola. About half of them are open for visitors and tourists. 2 are World Heritage Sites.
That's great. Yeah, and so in Liberia, I have a theory about why when Roberts destroyed the Barracoons, first of all, a lot of the Barracoons on our coast were built in the traditional style, right? And many Barracoons, even on the coast of Ivory Coast and so on. But we did have forts. You did, McQueen's house on the St. Paul River was described as a mansion. So McQueen actually had a Western style house built. John Stuart Mill had a Western style house built. Philippa Hayes had a Western style home where these people were not living in the same kind of dwellings that our indigenous people had. They had houses with windows and all of the furnishings that they would have had in the United States or other places, right? So they were building Western style homes. There was a factory at Cape Mount that the ruins of that factory could be seen until the 1920s. This was something that Roberts blew up with cannon fire. He was trying to snuff this out. Africans have a legacy, and this is all Africans globally, of not memorializing bad things.
Yeah.
We like to put it behind us. So I'm thinking that some of those things were not preserved because they were not built by our people. And you see, the other thing is the British are going to keep Elmina Castle up because it was built by them. And then after they stopped the slave trade, they still owned Ghana. They had signed treaties. They owned Elmina, they owned Cape Coast, they owned Accra. So they don't have to destroy these things. They're still their property and they still were useful. They still use them as prisons even after the slave trade, as stockades for their weapons even after the slave trade. So there's a difference of how certain things are preserved under the British territories and under European controlled areas. What Liberia did when the slave Barracoons were destroyed is they liberated those people and allowed to them to build and settle and establish towns over those Barracoons. So Greenville, Harper, Robertsport, Buchanan, all built on top of former Barracoons by the people who were liberated from those Barracoons, and then also served as a place of resettlement for other colonization societies down the road. So this is very, very important that Liberians understand how these cities' locations came to be and why they exist where they exist, who built them, who established them, and why. That's something that's very strangely absent from the consciousness of Liberian people. No one really talks about why Greenville was established. We only know why it was named, but it was there before it was settled. And why was it there? Why was it available for settlement? It's because the slave Barracoon had been destroyed. And when warlords are destroyed, the businesses are destroyed, they force them to sign treaties. You can no longer do this here, and so on and so forth.
Well, we thank you. We don't have a caller, and so let's conclude, Carl.
I think that was pretty much my conclusion. Please join us next Saturday. But I hope you enjoyed the show. If you have any questions, let us know. If you want to get some reference materials, reach out to us and we will share.
Definitely. Thank you so much. We want to thank you, Carl, and the team from Monrovia.
Yeah, they did what people did it. They just cut them off, cut off
we thank you.
the internet.
The tough time, but you keep pushing, and we really appreciate that. I want to thank our viewers for watching always. And you can check us up on Facebook, right? And YouTube. We have the History Channel playlist. Check it out for all the editions of that we've been having. We have a lot there, and so there's a lot to learn. Again, we want to thank you and join us next Saturday. Until then, we're going to close with a song that says, "We are all Liberians." Whether your descendants are from slaves, former slaves, or part of those with European DNA, native, whatever, we are all Liberians. Have a good night, and God bless you. Until next Saturday, same place, same station.
We are Liberians. Liberia is our home. Liberian people. Liberia.